in any case, that even in the days before the original sin, there's a hierarchy. Man is a political animal. That man is not. He does not perfect himself by just being born. When a beaver is born, he doesn't go to dam making school, and birds don't go to nest making school. Nest making school, and so on. But there's something about our nature that is political. Now, this is very, very important for the supernatural, more important the supernatural than it is for the natural. Because when we look at God, God is three in one. What is the beauty of God? The beauty of God is that He is a society. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are a society, and these three are one. And so when God said, "Let us make man according to our own image and likeness," there has to be a society aspect to deeply in our blood. And He wanted to make it very clear to us that that's so into our blood that what God did was He created Adam deliberately alone. He created Adam deliberately alone so that Adam would come back without original sin, without having made any mistakes, without having committed any sins. He's going to come back to God and say, "Lord, I am not happy to be alone." So and then God says, the first words He says about man before the original sin, "It is not good for man to be alone." Now that is true in the beauty of marriage, but it is infinitely more true in the church. It is not good for man to be alone. The very word church is something that's essential to religion. Church, the word church, in the Greek, is ekklesia. Ekklesia. Can't write Greek. Ekklesia means I call forth. It's an assembly. The people of God called forth. We pull people together. It's a source of unity. Man is pulled together with other men. So one of the great evils of the Protestant Revolution, one of the very great evils of the Protestant Revolution is this idea of my personal relationship with Jesus, my personal relationship with God. And I have my personal relationship, and I don't need society. And yet those very Protestants, what do they have? They've got Protestant churches. They shouldn't have them. If you've got your own private interpretation, and you've got your own personal relationship with God, don't go to the Baptist church. Because there's other Baptists over there telling you about their ideas about God. That's useless. So if you want to have a personal relationship with Jesus, a personal relationship with God, go ahead and have your personal relationship. But the problem is, human beings are not built that way. We cannot be that way. We have to be connected to other human beings. And we have to have a tri-unity inside of us. There must be a church. There has always been a church. And there will be a church until the ending of time. And this church is a visible society. It's a supernatural society, but it's a supernatural society made for men. It's a visible society, supernatural, made for men. And that God works His invisible supernatural grace through this society and goes to souls. So that there was, in the very beginning, there was priesthood. Cain was a priest and Abel was a priest. And what about these first levels of priests? The priest before Aaron. Before Aaron, any man could be a priest. And someone would choose a man to be a priest. To be a mediator between God and man. To take the prayers of the people and offer them up to God. And take the graces and things of God and give them to man. Because God made His grace come to us in a very real way. It comes to us through human beings. It comes to us through the church. He is going to pass that grace to the church. And then, and so how is He going to do this? And so that He's going to be through a church. There's going to be Cain, and he's a priest. And he's going to take his grains, because he's a farmer, and he's going to burn them up in holocaust to God. There's going to be Abel, and he is a priest, and he is going to take his flock from sheep from his flock, and he is going to sacrifice them to God. Now, Cain was displeasing to God, and Abel was pleasing to God. So now we see that there's a problem that comes into the priesthood, into the church, with original sin. God made Cain a priest. God made Abel a priest. God was not pleased with the sacrifice of Cain. He was pleased with the sacrifice of Abel. And there have to be sacrifices. He wasn't pleased with the sacrifice of Cain because he did not give of his best. He was pleased with the sacrifice of Abel, so pleased that all priests from that day on are going to be associated with Abel. And God will make sure, for instance, when he becomes man, he's going to be connected to Abel. What did St. John see? He saw a lamb, as it were, slaughtered. He saw a lamb, as it were, slaughtered. Where was the first lamb slaughtered? Who slaughtered the first lamb? Abel did. And Abel slaughtered the first lamb to give worship to God. And Abel gave a most pleasing worship to God by slaughtering a lamb. And therefore, when Abel was murdered, and Abel was not able to be the grandfather of our Lord Jesus Christ, Abel is never forgotten. God has always remembered Abel. And therefore, shepherd is in our blood, not just me as a priest. Shepherd is in all of our blood. That's why later on, when Joseph was going to the land of Egypt, he told there 72 members of his family. There were 72 members of the family at the time. That's all of Israel. He said, you tell Pharaoh and the Egyptians, we are shepherds. And that's all we know how to do is take care of sheep. We can't farm, we can't construct, we can't do anything. All we know how to do is be shepherds. We are all shepherds and we only know about sheep. That's the entire people of God. The entire church. Shepherd and sheep is something essential to our church. And God made sure that there was a shepherd and a sheep involved in our church ever since Abel was murdered by Cain. And there's that holy priesthood of Abel. And it continues, and Abel is never forgotten. And Abel is in us right now. So that there is a shepherd and there is a sheep. And then also, what does the book of Genesis tell us? And the Egyptians, what do they say? You go and stay in the land of Jesse. Because the Egyptians despise shepherds. And the Egyptians want nothing to do with shepherds. So, sheep, shepherd, sacrificing the lamb is something essential to this priesthood. We have to skip over many things, but something essential to the priesthood, and how God is going to administer His grace. Grace is going to flow from heaven. It's going to flow through a priest, and it's going to flow to souls. And even before original sin, Adam would have had to offer some kind of sacrifice. It would have been an unbloody sacrifice, like the sacrifice of Melchizedek, offering of bread and wine. But Adam would have offered a sacrifice, and Adam would have given up sacrifice to God. That's what Adam did, what Adam would have done. But then the original sin comes in the picture. He still had to offer sacrifice, and he did. But then Abel brought us the holy sacrifice, especially since he was murdered by Cain. And then the lamb is slain upon the altar in the New Testament. But God is going to be giving His grace supernaturally through Adam, through Noah, through Moses and Aaron, through Christ, through the New Testament priesthood. He's going to be passing down His grace. And it's going to flow through these men into real souls. It flows into our whole being. Remember that the grace that is flowing through us is for every part of our lives. The grace is not for the supernatural part. Because remember, we were talking about the helicopter thing, that the helicopter picking up the block, the whole block is being held in the air by the helicopter of grace. And it has to be 100% connected to it, or else it falls into the abyss. So that every part of the nature must be connected with grace. That's why, if you look inside of the ritual, the Roman ritual, there's a blessing of printing presses, there's a blessing of the house, a blessing of the marriage bed, a blessing of beer, a blessing of wine, a blessing of the animals, a blessing of the place of work. There's a blessing for everything. Because all things must be suffused with the supernatural. Not just the ecclesiastical building called the church. And not just the ecclesiastical time, which is called the time of Mass or the time of worship. The whole of the entirety of our being, the entirety of our lives is to be filled with that supernatural, and grace has to flow in. Now the grace, we talked about the gratia gratis faciens, the gratia gratis data, and then and this is not a perfect division, but just trying to simplify it here. Gifts, and there are the gifts, and then there's actual grace. Remember, the actual grace must be given completely. What grace is the church involved in? The church is involved in handing out the gifts and the actual graces, and also these actual graces which help increase sanctifying grace. So there's actual graces which help. It's like there's a minimum amount of air in the balloon. When you receive an actual grace, the balloon gets bigger. If you don't respond to it, the balloon gets smaller. So that our holiness can increase and our holiness can decrease. And it's always either increasing or decreasing at every moment. We're either responding to grace and increasing, or we're not responding to grace and decreasing. But we're not, the grace is increasing or decreasing. But it's not we'll wait for that postia. Postia. Yeah, we can put it there. Right? Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got you.
Father, it says
What?
8.
What?
It says 4 by 8.
Well, it has
Okay.
a stand, so it's,
It looks bigger than that. What? What? Okay.
so it has a stand to be put together, and then it's reversible.
Oh yeah, no, we'll stick it here. But afterwards, okay? Right? That solved that problem. Right? Okay. Yeah, because they didn't have, see, last year we didn't have this, the rain came in, right? Rain and snow came in, took care of that before we had closed it off, yeah. So, so in any case, we'll get that board then the next time, man, just a few minutes here. So that the movement of grace passing through the church, so the church, we're trying to figure out how to do it like some kind of a diagram here. So the grace is coming from God. It passes through the church. I'll do that. And from the church, it goes out to souls, right? How does it do that? God made this church that it does pass through the church into souls, and that's one reason why St. Alphonsus might say that he did say the world can go on without the Son. But if there is no Mass, it ceases to exist. We've got to understand that there's a physical, St. Robert Bellamy used to emphasize this quite a bit, there's a physical side to grace. It's not just like the Protestant clouds hanging in the sky. There's a physical side. Grace enters into this world. Now we've got a problem because of original sin. This supernatural, beautiful grace, it can never become ugly. Supernatural grace can never become stained. But God has willed that this grace is going to pass through a church. It's going to pass through souls. There's going to be ministers of that grace. There's going to be the bishops of the church. Whatever, no sort of bishop. So they're going to pass through the ministers, and it's going to go to souls. And then in the Old Testament, Aaron, and then of course Moses. But remember, that was the religion of death, says St. Paul. It did not have the power to give life. But grace flowed there, and the life came when the gates of heaven were opened, when Christ died on the cross and rose from the dead. But that the life passed through this, the grace passes the church, and it's physical. It's going out to souls. And remember also, it's supernatural. So what is the grace that comes? It's the actual graces, causing an increase in sanctifying grace. Or you have someone in the state of mortal sin, it's going to pour the sanctifying grace inside of them. There has to be something to, when the soul is in the state of mortal sin, the enemy of God, and baptism happens, or confession happens, or a perfect act of contrition happens. St. Thomas points out, grace always comes instant and complete. Because it's a spiritual thing. I don't mean spiritual sense of holy, spiritual sense of immaterial. You're either a dog or you're not a dog. You're either table or you're not a table. You can't slowly become table. You can't slowly become dog. The nature comes in, bang, it's there. So the grace is put in instantly. And it says now we have a problem because man is going to receive the grace, but in order to receive the grace, he's got to be disposed to receive the grace. He's got to be in position to receive that grace. God gives him the grace to be disposed, then he has a free will. He can choose to reject it or to accept it. He has to be disposed or prepared for grace. So there's a preparation for grace. So that there has to be a living human being who's going to receive a real grace, and that when that living human being dies and passes to eternity, he's no longer disposed to receive grace. That's why whatever state you are at the moment of death, that's it. You're no longer in a position to receive grace anymore. So if in the moment of death you don't have grace inside of you, that is, you don't have the Faciens grace, the making grace, sanctifying grace, habitual grace, if you don't have sanctifying grace inside of you, it can't be put in. You're no longer capable of receiving grace. Bang! You're eternally in that state. Because remember, I given the example of the helicopter, you know, whatever stupid helicopter is. Okay, and it is holding up the grace. As long as you're in, it's got the ropes attached to the nature. Those ropes are attached only as long as you're in life. When you leave life, no more movement. It's either where if you're attached, bang, you go up into heaven. If you're not attached, bang, you go down into hell. There's whatever that state is at the moment of death. The reason why it has to be that way is because when you reach the moment of death, you no longer have the capacity to have any changes anymore. As long as in your life you have the capacity to change. Receive grace on Monday and accept it. Reject grace on Tuesday. Accept it again on Wednesday. Reject it on Thursday. And in whatever moment that you die, whatever state you are at the moment of death, that's it. The grace no longer can come. Now where does this grace come from? It comes from God. It channels through Holy Mother Church. And it goes into souls. And it must be always flowing. Because remember, it's not enough that it came from the past. It's got to be coming from the present. That's why we can't stand, for instance, we can't stand on the Catholic Church of 1800 AD. The Catholic Church of 500. No, the Catholic Church is alive today. And the Catholic Church puts grace in today. That's what we talk about, for instance, in our case and tradition, we speak about supplied jurisdiction. I need supplied jurisdiction right now. You know, I don't need it before, you know. I don't need it tomorrow. I need it now. I either have jurisdiction now to hear the confession or I don't. And I have to, it has to be a present thing. It's not something going back to the past or pushing forward to the future. I've got to be connected to Christ, connected to the church, connected to the authority of God right now. And I am. I'm either connected by ordinary jurisdiction or extraordinary jurisdiction. But I have to be connected by one of those. And if I'm cut off, then I'm no longer an instrument of grace. And so that the grace has got to be coming straight down. So it has to be connected both ways. Talk about, remember the mark of apostolicity, the fourth mark of the church. That I've got authority coming down and going back. So that we have a church which is the same all the way back to the apostles. But it's also the same all the way up to God. It can't be just back to the apostles. The Orthodox have apostolic lineage as far as ordination goes. And so they're all validly ordained priests apostolically, but they're not connected to God. They're cut off. Being cut off, they are not able to be instruments of true instruments of grace. They have to be connected both ways, both going backwards to Christ and upwards to Christ. God is above and God is behind. And then we would carry that forward. And we must be always connected. Every moment connected. And so that the instrument of grace, be instruments of grace as we're connected. And the grace, as like St. Thomas said earlier, St. Thomas said that even one actual grace, one little grace, not beat up your little brother. If you took a picture of that grace, it's more beautiful than the entire universe. So these graces are exceedingly, infinitely powerful. It's just they're given to us in a superabundance. When St. Alphonsus says that the world can continue without the sun, not without the Mass. It doesn't mean there's going to be millions of Masses or thousands of Masses, but there must be at least one Mass each day. There must be at least one Mass somewhere in the world. Not more than one is required. Because remember, the very first Mass, the Mass, is only the one Mass. The Mass of Jesus Christ on the cross. There's only one Mass. And no matter how many millions of Masses there are, they're all part of the one Mass. So it's only necessary that there be one priest somewhere in the world, could even be by himself in the mountains, doesn't matter. One priest somewhere in the world with the true faith, connected to Christ backwards, so he's got he's a priest and has the same faith of his ancestors, got the same beliefs, and he's got the connection to the priesthood that way, going backwards. But he also has to be connected upwards through the hierarchy. He's got to be connected upwards through to Christ, through the Holy Church. And when he's got that double connection, the true faith and the connection to the hierarchy of the church in the correct way, when he has those two things, on all the elements that go along with each of those two things, the necessary elements, then he is a channel of grace. And that it is necessary to have at least one. At least one. We know that, and St. Robert Bellarmine, interesting in his argument against the Protestants. Because the Protestants claim there were many times in the church of the Old Testament when there were no good prophets. There are many times in which there were no good priests. And therefore there was no pleasing sacrifice offered to God. And at those times the church was truly invisible. And St. Robert Bellarmine says absolutely no. When it says multiple times in sacred scripture, for instance, God said to Elias, all the priests have abandoned me. All the shepherds are wicked. There are no prophets in Israel. When he said that, there were prophets in Judah, which is the other side. Israel is one half, Judah is the other. And furthermore, one of the prophets of Israel happened to be Elias. So he was obviously referring to a general term. The majority of prophets are not pleasing to me. Not all. The majority of priests are not pleasing to me. Not all, absolutely. But it says in Scripture, all the priests. But it's very clear from the context, it doesn't mean every single priest. And it's very clear from the context, he's talking to a priest. He's talking to a prophet. God will never let His church be completely eclipsed. But there will be times in that church's history where there may be very few faithful priests or very few faithful prophets. Fine, that can happen. But there will be visible prophets, not invisible ones. Visible priests, not invisible ones. And there will be channels of grace. And even if you don't know specifically which one, if you've never met one of them, because it can happen, for instance, look at the famous case of the Japanese. Not only them, they're the famous case, 200 years without a priest. Okay, they were 200 years without a priest. There were faithful Catholics in India who remained fidelity to the Pope but hadn't talked to him for about 500 years because of the problem of the Muslims. The Muslims cut off India from Europe. And yet there were still faithful Catholics there who knew about the Holy Father, but they were never able to connect with him because they were cut off by many Muslim kingdoms. And they remained faithful and they remained connected. But they didn't even know who the Pope was. They knew he was a real man in Rome, but they were not able to connect to him. And so there must be a real physical side to the administration of the grace, and it's going to pass down through the administration of the church. And what is the grace that flows through? 5 minutes to the office here. The grace that flows through, actual grace, and also the gifts, and they go to the soul. They don't make you an automatic saint, but they're channels of grace. And then how do the sacraments give grace? Well, there's the sacramentals and the sacraments are both instruments of grace. We get about the church gives grace, administers grace, principally through the sacramentals, the sacraments, which go straight to the New Testament, and the sacramentals. We put with that sacramentals all prayers like the Rosary, holy, just put them all in one category. The sacramentals can be, of course, scapular, but put in all private prayers. Anything that's not a sacrament, and sometimes could include the use of the sacraments. No, I won't use that. the private prayers, etc. Then there's the sacraments, which of course is the 7 sacraments. 7 sacraments. The church is using these things to give grace. The sacrament, and it's a vehicle that carries grace to souls, and the grace of the sacraments, they pass ex opere operato. We want to close here. And the grace of the sacramentals, they pass ex opere operantis. So by the work of the thing itself, the work of the thing worked, sacraments, and the work of the worker, the one working, the sacramentals. So you become the means to carry grace when you pray the rosary, whereas the water is the means to carry grace in the case of baptism. The work itself carries grace in the case of baptism and sacraments, and then the person carries a grace in the other sacramentals. And the church puts a power into it. You get it matters whether you have a blessed a blessed rosary or a blessed items. The church gives them a special. There's a power that comes from blessing, and then there's a greater power. But then it depends on how it's used. If used with devotion, it gives a greater grace. It's a vehicle of greater grace. And if it's used with less devotion, it's a vehicle of lesser grace. And then there are the various channels of grace, practical channels. We'll say a prayer here, and it's time for the Holy Office. We'll go and say a prayer. In the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, amen. Glory to the Father, the Son, Holy Ghost. St. Vincent Ferrer, St. Jude, Lady Victory, Lady Sorrows, the Alpha Christians, St. Ignatius, in the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, amen.